Originally, my program today was supposed to be about the rise and fall of patent medicines in the 19th century. That presentation was postponed until next October after Jeremy and I had a discussion about the upcoming 100th anniversary of the tri-state tornado. Jeremy thought it would be appropriate to do something to commemorate this tragic event, and I agreed. This presentation is the result. So why was this storm so historic? The tri-state tornado was the deadliest tornado in American history, killing at least 695 people. It was also the second most deadly tornado in world history, behind a tornado in Bangladesh that killed approximately 1,300 people in 1989. Based on reports and interviews with survivors, the tri-state tornado was thought to be a wedge tornado, like the one in the slide here, though at times multiple vortices or funnels were reported to be seen. Adding to the number of deaths and injuries was the fact that in many places its victims did not see a funnel cloud approaching. Instead, they reported seeing things like a rolling black mass that screened the tornado's funnel from view. The tornado was on the ground for 3.5 hours, whereas the duration of an average tornado is between 5 and 10 minutes. It had the fastest forward moving speed of any tornado in the United States, averaging 62 miles per hour along most of its journey, with a forward speed as high as 73 miles per hour between the towns of Gorham and Murphysboro in Illinois. The forward speed of an average tornado is only 30 miles per hour. It was the most destructive tornado in American history, destroying 15,000 homes. The storm reached F5 intensity at multiple points along its path, and I'll talk about the Fujita scale that measures tornado strength momentarily. What's important to understand here is that 99.9% of all tornadoes are classified as F4 or below. Just 0.1% of all tornadoes ever reach F5 strength. Finally, the tri-state tornado holds the record for the longest track of a tornado at 219 miles. Studies have been done that question whether or not this was in fact one tornado, but their conclusions were that even though there appeared to be some gaps in the damaged areas in Missouri, there was not enough evidence to firmly say that there was more than one tornado along the 219-mile path of this storm. So why did this storm set so many records? You have probably heard the term perfect storm. That's exactly what this storm was. It was a rare phenomenon, and there are several factors that contributed to its extraordinary strength and duration. The first factor was a favorable set of atmospheric conditions. There was a significant temperature difference between the warm, moist air near the ground and the colder air aloft. This created an unstable atmosphere, which is essential for the formation of severe thunderstorms and tornadoes. Additionally, there was a strong jet stream flowing across the region, which provided the necessary wind shear to help the tornadoes spin and organize. Second was the large-scale weather pattern itself. The low-pressure system that was in place helped to focus and intensify the storm activity. This system provided the energy and lift needed for the tornado to form and persist. The supercell that developed within this system was also strengthened because of its position near the center of the low pressure system itself. As shown in the diagram here, the supercell thunderstorm that spawned the tri-state tornado was 20 miles wide and 30 miles long. Finally, there was the unique set of geographic features. The tornado's path took it through a region with a unique geographic feature such as the Mississippi River Valley and the Ozark Mountains. These features can influence the behavior of tornadoes by increasing areas of divergence or convergence, which can affect the strength and duration of the storm. The tri-state tornado was the result of a rare alignment of factors. It was a combination of favorable atmospheric conditions, a large-scale weather pattern, unique geographic features, and other factors that came together to create a storm of unprecedented power and duration. Before I get started with the details of the slideshow, I need to talk about some limitations in making this presentation. Unfortunately, there's just no way that I can adequately cover the true impact of this historic event in just 45 minutes. If I pique your interest in this storm at all, I would suggest that you find out more by reading any or all of the books that I have listed in the handout. Each contains different stories from that tragic day. To start, I would recommend The Forgotten Storm, the Great Tri-State Tornado of 1925 by Wallace Aiken. Aiken was almost 2 years old, living in Murphysboro, Illinois, when the storm hit and devastated his town. He studied meteorology in college, served in World War II, and later became a much beloved professor teaching meteorology before his death in 2012. More about his story in a minute. This presentation will cover the storm, the destruction, the number of dead and injured, and the aftermath. What will be missing for the most part is the human element and the long-term impacts on the lives of those involved. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of stories from this storm. Luckily, many of those stories were recorded in the newspapers from that time, and those newspapers are available for research today. Additionally, many of the authors who wrote books and researchers who studied the storms did so when many of those impacted by the storm were still alive. Those books are where these stories still reside, waiting to be read. Think about it for a second. At least 695 lives were lost, and thousands of people were injured. The storm did not discriminate between rich and poor, young and old, or black and white. It didn't care what religion you were or what your social standing was in your community. In many, many places, the dead were so horribly mutilated by the forces of the storm that the identification of the bodies was extremely difficult and in some cases impossible. Some bodies were found impaled in trees. Others were crushed. Some that were picked up and carried away by the tornado were never found. While death was quick for many, in places like Murphysboro, Illinois, fires broke out and claimed the lives of individuals still alive who could not be freed from the rubble around them, some of these after 48 hours. 48 hours of knowing what was approaching and being helpless to get away. Why some lived and some died is a question that was asked over and over again. In Annapolis, Missouri, where 90% of the town was destroyed or damaged by the tornado, one of the few buildings mostly spared was the school, where no children were injured. Yet, in DeSoto, Illinois, the tornado targeted the school, killing 33 of the approximately 200 children attending grades 1 through 12 there. That number remains a record today for students killed in a school struck by a tornado. Similarly, there are countless stories of individual miracles, for lack of a better word. Babies torn from their mother's arms by the tornado only to be found safe and unharmed. Outside of Beale, Missouri in Perry County, the Garner School with its teacher and 25 students inside was literally picked up by the tornado. All were deposited in neighboring fields and all survived, injured but alive. And while there were miracles for many, many more, the opposite was true. Even those lucky enough to escape with their lives lost loved ones, friends and neighbors, their homes, their places of business, or had such bad injuries that their ability to work was forever changed. In some cases, it took decades to recover. I promise to tell you more about Wallace Aiken and his family story, and they will serve as an example of how the tornado had lasting impacts. Wallace was 2 years old and playing on the floor of the family home in Murphysboro, Illinois, as the storm approached. As their home began to shake, his mother grabbed him up from the floor just before the tornado picked up their home off its foundation. While the walls and ceilings remained, the home's roof was torn off before the home was deposited on top of the family's detached garage, which in turn had been deposited on top of a neighbor's destroyed home. Other than some bruises and scratches, mother and son were uninjured. Wallace's father and elder brother were at the family's car dealership that had just received a shipment of new cars. Wallace's father had just departed the business with his check written to the insurance company for the insurance on those new cars when the tornado struck. Wallace's older brother was uninjured, but his father was not so lucky. Knocked unconscious by the storm, he was found with the insurance check still in his coat pocket. He would survive, but it would take decades for the family to recover financially. While the building housing the dealership was covered by insurance, all the new cars that had just arrived were a complete loss and uninsured. Still, the Aiken family was among the more lucky ones, as they all escaped with their lives. Shortly, I will put the storm in its historical perspective, and it's important to place the storm in the context of the time period in which it occurred. The presentation will then move on to cover the storm itself and its aftermath. When we talk about the tri-state tornado, it's important to do so from a historical perspective. In 1925, there was little or no warning of impending tornadoes. Radar had not yet been invented, and mass communication was scarce. Meteorologists of that time period were constrained by the things that they did not know. The jet stream was yet to be discovered, and knowledge of thunderstorms and other tornadoes they sometimes generated was very limited. They were also hampered by limited prediction capabilities and by some restrictions placed upon them by the authorities in charge of weather forecasting. More on that shortly. In contrast, today we have sophisticated Doppler weather radar coupled with complex algorithms that aid meteorologists in identifying areas within a storm that may produce tornadoes or other hazardous conditions. We also have multiple warning platforms that aid in getting the message out about severe storms and tornadoes. From your cell phone to your TV, radio, warning sirens, text alerts, weather radios, and the like, all have helped to get the word out to those potentially impacted so that they may take shelter. Research continues as well, as there is still much to be learned. We will continue to see advancements in technology, algorithms, and the leveraging of artificial intelligence to improve our understanding of these storms and to aid in their forecasting. Part of that knowledge will come from a new generation of meteorologists. One of the next generation of meteorologists is my granddaughter, Izzy Collins, pictured here. She is a senior in the Department of Geography and Meteorology at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. She is pictured on the left presenting the weather on her university's TV station, and on the right chasing a tornado last summer in Oklahoma as part of a group of students and faculty from her university. It's also important to trace the development of tornado forecasting. In the 1880s, our nation's weather forecasting was under the control of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. It was during this time that Lieutenant John C. Finley was given the assignment to study tornadoes and how to forecast for them. He was making significant strides when his work came to an abrupt halt in 1887. General Adolphus Greely took command of the Signal Corps at that time and ordered Finley to stop his work. Greely believed that since you could not forecast exactly where a tornado was going to touch down, there was no point to doing the research. Greely also banned the use of the word tornado from any weather forecast, believing that the word's use would only cause panic by the public. Responsibility for weather forecasting was transferred to the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1891, but the ban on using the word tornado in forecasting remained in place. If you were to go back and read the weather forecast for March 18th for southeast Missouri, southern Illinois, or southwest Indiana, you won't see the word tornado mentioned or even the threat of severe storms. While the ban remained in place, it didn't completely stop tornado research. In 1948, two scientists assigned to Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma were studying tornadoes and building on the work of Finley. At one point through their research, they successfully predicted that a tornado would strike their base the next day, and it did. Their forecast, which was taken seriously by base officials, helped to limit the destruction and injuries caused by that tornado. Finally, the ban on tornado forecasting was lifted in 1952, Since that time, advancements in our knowledge and technology have increased so much that the warning time for possible tornado activity has increased from 5 minutes or less to between 10 and 15 minutes. That difference in time allows more people to take shelter and saves lives. So why is it called Tornado Alley? As mentioned earlier, one of the factors in the strength and longevity of the tri-state tornado was the geography of the land where we live. The United States is one of the few countries in the world where mountain ranges run from north to south. To our west are the Rocky Mountains, and to our east, the Appalachian Mountains. With the vast expanse of open land between them and the proximity of that land to the warm, moist air that sometimes sweeps up from the Gulf of Mexico, two of the necessary conditions for the formation of tornadoes are present. Add time of year, with spring being the most active time for tornadoes, and the clashing warm and cold fronts, and even more of the necessary ingredients are in place. Turning now to the tri-state tornado itself, the map presented on this slide shows its path of destruction that touched 13 counties across 3 states as well as 19 plus communities along the way. The tornado's duration was approximately 3.5 hours, with the tornado's first touchdown witnessed at 1:01 p.m. in the afternoon at a point 3 miles north-northwest of Ellington in Reynolds County. The tornado would dissipate at 4:30 that afternoon, 3 miles southwest of Petersburg, Indiana. Through most of its life, the tornado was about 3/4 of a mile wide, though it did reach 1 mile in width at some points. It also reached F5 strength at multiple points along its path. A tornado's strength and destructive capabilities are measured on the Fujita scale. That scale was created by Dr. Ted Fujita in 1971. It was revised in 2007 and is now called the Enhanced Fujita Scale. Tornadoes are classified into one of 6 categories, ranging from an EF0 to an EF5. The classification is based on a sustained 3-second wind speed. At the low end of the scale, an EF0 tornado would have a sustained wind speed between 65 and 85 miles per hour and would likely cause only minor damage. At the other end of the scale, an EF5 tornado would have a sustained wind speed of greater than 200 miles per hour and could destroy a whole town. This slide presents a condensed timeline of the tri-state tornado. The tornado first touches down in Missouri at 1:01 p.m. and then travels 85 miles through the state in about 90 minutes, killing 11 people in its wake. The tornado crosses the Mississippi River into southern Illinois at 2:25 p.m. In the next hour and 35 minutes, the tornado will travel 121 miles through the state, taking another 613 lives along its path. The tornado then crosses the Wabash River into southwest Indiana at 4 p.m. Before it dissipates at 4:30 p.m., it will travel another 58 miles and claim the lives of another 71 victims. March 18, 1925, was an unusually warm day for the middle of March. It was the kind of day that people from Missouri to Indiana would be leery of, as warm days at this time of the year often brought storms. What would become the tri-state tornado was first sighted at 1:01 p.m. a few miles north-northwest of Ellington. Its forward speed at this early stage of its life was 60 miles per hour, about twice the forward speed of an average tornado. The tornado's path was 21 degrees north of east, and it would remain constant until passing through Owensville, Indiana, some 3 hours later. In its early stage, it did damage to some farms in the vicinity of Redford, Missouri, and it also claimed its first life, that of Sam Flowers. Sam had just celebrated his 49th birthday 2 days before the tornado struck and was caught out in the open when the tornado hit. He was on horseback and on his way home to his own farm. His horse returned home riderless, and a search party found Sam's body early the next day. You may be wondering, how did they know how fast the tornado was moving? Throughout its course, its forward speed was calculated by noting when and where it was sighted and using the distance and time between 2 points to calculate its forward speed. You may also be wondering how the Fujita scale could be applied to this tornado when it hadn't even been invented yet. Ratings for the wind speed and destructiveness of the tornado were determined by trained experts reviewing the damage reports and photographs taken at the time. When the tornado struck Annapolis at 1:15 p.m., the townspeople didn't see it. Instead, witnesses to the event described seeing a smoky fog that came rolling over the hills, or describing it like a curtain coming down over the sun. In its wake, 90% of the town was damaged or destroyed. 2 people were killed at Annapolis, including one of those deaths occurring at the American lead mine in nearby Ledana. Another 25 people were injured. There was little time between when the tornado struck Annapolis and when it arrived at Ledana. Osro Kelly, pictured on the left of the inset photo at the bottom right of the slide, his wife and children had just returned from shopping in Annapolis. Seeing the storm approaching, Osro's wife took their children inside their home while Osro stayed on the front porch looking at the approaching storm. That decision cost him his life. Osro's wife was seriously injured but survived. In the wake of the tornado's passing, 90% of the above-ground mine property was destroyed or damaged, including the mine's hoisting equipment. 75 miners were trapped 465 feet underground and had to use emergency ladders installed in an air shaft to climb to the surface. When they got there, they found that 21 of the 54 miners' homes at Ledana had been destroyed. The tornado then continued on its northeasterly course, passing through rural areas in Madison and Bollinger counties. In Madison County, it passed through south of Cherokee Pass and north of Marquand, where it caused $1,000 worth of damage in 1925 dollars near the farming village of Cornwall. It destroyed 8 farms in Bollinger County, and near Licksville, it collapsed the Conrad School, killing one of the students and injuring 16 other students along with their teacher. The tornado then crossed into Perry County, hitting the town of Bealey at 2 p.m., leaving behind 4 dead and 11 injured. Between Bealey and the Mississippi River, the storm damaged another 30 farms, killing 4 and injuring 25 before crossing the Mississippi River at 2:25 p.m. It was only getting started, and southern Illinois lay ahead in its sights. Southern Illinois, in fact, would take the brunt of the tornado's destructive power, crossing 121 miles of the state in just over 90 minutes. Between Gorham and nearby Murphysboro, the tornado reached its fastest forward speed of 73 miles per hour. The tornado reached F5 strength at multiple locations in Illinois, and at times it grew to be a mile wide. A total of 613 people would die in Illinois as the result of the tornado, and thousands more would be injured. Gorham, near the Mississippi River, population 500, was the first town hit by the tri-state tornado in southern Illinois. Again, the people of the town did not see the tornado approaching. Citizens described seeing the approach of a great wall of black smoke with white billows that looked like steam. The white billows were water sucked up by the tornado as it crossed the Mississippi River. The tornado struck the town at 2:26 p.m., destroying the entire town and taking 37 lives, including the lives of 7 students killed at the Gorham School. 170 townspeople were injured. Nearby Murphysboro, with a population of 12,000, was struck by the tornado at 2:34 p.m. One person described seeing the approaching storm as a wall of blackness with the sound of 100 freight trains. The tornado was up to a mile wide at this point and smashed through 152 blocks of the town, damaging or destroying 1,200 buildings and destroying 40% of the town. Additional damage and lives were taken by fires that were started in some of the damaged structures where people were trapped and couldn't get free, even with the help of rescuers. What follows are some of the photos of the destruction at Murphysboro. Shown here are two of the heavily damaged schools in Murphysboro. On the left is the Longfellow School, where 9 students lost their lives, and on the right is the Logan School, where 5 children died. This slide shows before and after photos of the Mobile and Ohio railroad shops at Murphysboro. And this slide shows the before and after photos of the Reliance Mill at Murphysboro. Located 6 miles northeast of Murphysboro, DeSoto, Illinois, was the next town in the tornado's path. It struck the town at 2:48 p.m., taking about 2 minutes to cross through the town. In its wake, no building escaped damage, and 69 people, including 33 students, were dead. Between DeSoto and West Frankfort, the tornado first struck the small mining community of Bush, Illinois, at 2:53 p.m., killing 7 and injuring 37. Within the 14 miles between Bush and West Frankfort, the tornado damaged or destroyed multiple farms, killing another 24 people and injuring 18. In 1925, West Frankfort, Illinois was an important manufacturing and mining center. 2 of the largest coal mines in the United States were located there, the Orient No. 2 mine and the Old Bend No. 8 mine. The tornado went around the downtown area, but directly targeted the Orient No. 2 mine, trapping some 800 miners 600 feet underground. Like the mine at Ladana, miners here also had to use emergency ladders to escape through an air shaft. When they reached the surface, they found that 500 of their homes had been destroyed, leaving 2,000 people homeless. The death toll at West Frankfort was 148, with another 410 people injured. The final Illinois town in the tornado's path was Parrish, a small mining community with a population of about 300. The tornado hit the town at 3:15 p.m., destroying 37 of the 40 buildings in town. One of the buildings left standing was the town school, where the school's headmaster had been keeping an eye on the approaching storm and had decided against releasing his students. That decision saved all their lives. Most of the 22 people that died, as well as the 62 people who were injured, were women and children of preschool age. The men were all underground at nearby mines, and the school-age children were at the school previously mentioned. Between Parrish and the Indiana border, the tornado didn't hit any more towns, but did lay waste to multiple farms, killing another 65 people and injuring 140 more. The tornado crossed the Wabash River into Indiana just before 4 p.m. Just to the east of the Wabash River lies the town of Griffin, Indiana. Its population in 1925 was 400. Having crossed the Wabash River, the tri-state tornado strikes the town of Griffin at 4 p.m. None of the town's 80 to 90 buildings escaped damage, and the town, its homes, and businesses were mostly destroyed. As occurred in Murphysboro, some of the damaged buildings in Griffin caught fire with people trapped inside with no hope of escape. In all, 25 people died in Griffin and another 202 were injured. 11 minutes after striking Griffin at 4:11 p.m., the tornado reached Owensville, Indiana. Damage in Owensville was mostly confined to the north of town. It's also at Owensville where the tornado changed its course for the first time since the touchdown in Reynolds County, Missouri, more than 3 hours earlier. Shifting its path slightly more north, the tornado claims another 6 lives and 47 injured in the rural area between Owensville and Princeton. Princeton, Indiana now becomes the 3rd largest city in the tornado's path. The tornado traveled the 10 miles from Owensville to Princeton in 7 minutes. As in other locations, the residents of Princeton saw no funnel cloud, instead describing the tornado as an approaching dark cloud. The tornado struck the southwest part of Princeton, which was where two of the town's major industries were located, the Southern Railway shops and the H.T. Heinz ketchup factory. Surrounding these two major employers were the homes of their workers. In the wake of its march through Princeton, the tornado left behind 45 dead and 152 injured, mostly in this part of town. The tri-state tornado then traveled another 12 miles in 13 minutes, striking another 12 farms in its path before dissipating at 4:30 p.m. In the immediate wake of the tornado, the initial response was universal across all the impacted towns and other locations. The first on the scene were the town's residents themselves. Residents, neighbors, workers, people from other nearby towns all rushed to the aid of their stricken neighbors. In reality, it's not really different from what we see today in the wake of such storms. Their first priority was rescuing those that were trapped in the rubble. Then came the treatment of the injured, assessing the injuries and separating the patients by the extent of their injuries. Finally came the recovery of the dead. Attention then turned to providing for the immediate needs of the survivors. In the wake of the tornado, there was often as many stories about the tornado's aftermath as there were about its destruction. I wanted to use the following example from Wallace Aiken's book, The Forgotten Storm, the Great Tri-State Tornado of 1925, because I think it sums up that spirit of community in the face of tragedy. Alpha Jones, a teacher at a rural school between Gorham and Grand Tower, outside the path of the tornado, lived as a boarder with the family of a student, Bernice Bright. On that Wednesday night, Alpha did not return home until 9 p.m. because after school she had hurried to Gorham to care for the wounded. She came through the doorway that night distraught and exhausted. Gorham was no more, she told the Brights. Many had died, and the wounded needed medical care, but had none because nearby Murphysboro, also devastated, had even greater need for help. The family sat up late into the night discussing the day's tragic event. They decided to rise early the next morning to go offer help and take food and other necessities. In Gorham, when they arrived in the morning, volunteers directed the women to a nearby school that was serving as a temporary morgue. Once there, they headed for the basement, the center of activity, where bodies laid out in rows awaiting washing. The shock of seeing the town in ruins had been difficult, but now the full human impact of the horror gripped them. For a moment they simply stared. Then the women quickly set to work, helping to prepare the dead for burial. From early morning to late evening, they washed the corpses of men and women, adults and children of all ages, blackened from the wind-blown dirt and debris, many with grotesque wounds. These small-town people were used to caring for themselves and each other. For the most part hardy and stoic in the face of adversity, they prized physical labor as a manifestation of self-reliance. Washing the bodies of the dead was a service commonly offered by sympathetic neighbors. The townsfolk were close, many of them entering and departing this world near the small towns where they had lived out their lives. The story of the tri-state tornado was picked up quickly by the local and big city newspapers, in many cases while the tornado was still making its deadly march. Imagine what it must have been like at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch when the story came in about Annapolis, within an hour of its occurrence, only then to be followed by reports of death and destruction from Beeley, then Gorham, then Murphysboro, and beyond. As newspapers learned of the devastation, they quickly sent out reporters and filed stories. And while some of these early estimates exaggerated the death toll, the news of the destruction helped to mobilize later relief efforts. Getting help to the stricken communities was hindered by the fact of what was euphemistically called roads in 1925. While the quality of roads was getting better by this time, they were still a far cry from what they are today. It also sometimes didn't help when sightseers took to those roads to come and witness the destruction for themselves. Where a town was served by a railroad, it was almost always the case that the railroads and the Red Cross were the first to respond. It took the first relief train 5 hours to reach Annapolis from St. Louis, but a portion of that delay was taken up with the gathering of medical equipment, drugs, doctors, nurses, and the like. The railroad also brought the Red Cross workers with them. Further, the railroads were used to transport the more critically injured patients to hospitals in Poplar Bluff and St. Louis. Here and in other places along the rail lines, the railroads offered free transport to tornado victims seeking shelter with family members in nearby towns or to families visiting their injured loved ones in city hospitals. Once on station, the Red Cross took charge. In Annapolis, they used the mostly undamaged school to set up a shelter for the town's women and children. They brought in tents, housing mobile kitchens, and provided tents to shelter those who lost their homes. They would eventually offer financial aid to the victims as well to help them rebuild their homes, though this sometimes caused complaints over how those funds were distributed. Aiding the Red Cross was the National Guard units called out to aid in the recovery efforts. The tri-state tornado and the stories of its victims filled the newspapers around the country for days. Larger newspapers started collecting money for the victims and listing the donors' names in their papers. States, cities, and towns, as well as churches, schools, and other organizations, started relief efforts as well, collecting not only money, but anything else that might be needed by the tornado's victims to help them restart their lives. When the transition from relief to rebuilding began for towns like Annapolis, Gorham, Parrish, and Griffin, it was made harder by the fact that they were basically starting from scratch. Yet, with the exception of Parrish, all those towns did come back. None ever made it back to their pre-tornado footing, but then, like other towns struck by the tornado, other factors were also at play. Pictured here is a 1920s pre-tornado postcard of the Brown Shoe Factory in Murphysboro, Illinois, along with a 1940s photograph of the same factory. Although heavily damaged by the tornado, Brown Shoe did rebuild and was part of Murphysboro's economic scene until 1962 when the factory closed for good. Also heavily damaged was the Mobile and Ohio Railroad shops in Murphysboro. And while the M&O was a hero during the relief effort, their promise to rebuild their railroad shops in Murphysboro went unfulfilled. Other economic factors were also at play. While the lead mines at Ladana eventually reopened, it was closed again a few years later when other deposits of lead were found in Reynolds County and elsewhere that were cheaper to recover than the deposits near Annapolis. The same was true for the Illinois coal mines at West Frankfort. Labor costs were higher in Illinois than elsewhere, and those costs eventually led to the closure of these mines. Then, 4.5 years later, Black Friday occurs in October 1929, with the Great Depression to follow, bringing an abrupt end to the economic recovery of the areas affected by the tri-state tornado. In the aftermath of the storm, survivors always kept an eye to the sky, and in many places, the first thing rebuilt by a family was not their home, but a storm shelter. Today, there are few physical reminders left of that tragic day in March 1925. If you know where to look, you may find a vacant lot or foundation where a house or business once stood before the tornado. You might also find a historical roadside marker in places like Murphysboro. More likely than not, though, you will find people that never knew that the event even occurred. You might ask the question, could an event like this ever happen again? The answer is yes, and further, it already has. In December 2011, an event known as the Quad State Tornado struck northeastern Arkansas, the Boot Heel of Missouri, the northwest corner of Tennessee, and a portion of western Kentucky. The 250-mile path of this storm was initially believed to have eclipsed the 219-mile long record of the tri-state tornado. Subsequent investigation revealed that the quad state tornado was actually a series of tornadoes and not just one as originally thought. The big difference between then and now, however, is that we know much more about these storms and our warning systems and times are much improved. So, while the duration record of the tri-state tornado may one day fall, we should hopefully never again come close to the record of 695 people losing their lives. Again, if I have piqued your interest at all in this storm, I suggest you read any or all of the books listed in your handout. I think you will find them worth your time. Thank you very much.